is Ethan Taubes, and for those of you who I don't know, I am the son of Jacob Taubes, so that there's no mystery there. So we begin with full disclosure. The other thing is I want to thank everybody, especially Susan Nyman, for inviting me, and to use the words that my father did in his letter to Carl Schmitt, which was that, thank you so much for the cordial reception. Indeed, for the reception of a friend. I want to plant the seed of a couple of sayings, maxims. I mean, we all know sovereign is he who decides the exception. And Schmitt added to that, the exception is more interesting than the rule. The rule proves nothing, the exception proves everything. In the exception, the power of real life breaks through the crust of the mechanisms of bureaucracy that have become torpid and repetitious. Now, I just want to interject briefly that aside from being a person from the theater, I'm also a human rights lawyer, and I worked for over 20 years in the belly of the bureaucratic beast in the United States. I was a human rights lawyer, but also an asylum and refugee attorney. And I processed refugees for over 20 years. So I know a lot about bureaucracy. I know a lot about the rule of law. I know how important it is to have due process and to look at the details to make sure that the Leviathan is behaving in a proper and, let's say, responsible manner. The next quote that I think is kind of interesting is from Benjamin, and he says, "The tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live the state of emergency in which we live is not an exception to the rule, but the rule." So basically, he's turning Schmitt around and saying, we live in the exception already. You don't have to keep looking for it everywhere. And to create a fascist dictatorship, we, in the tradition of the oppressed, we're always living in a state of emergency. And another quote that I think is important to keep in mind to sow the seeds is something from Gandhi where he says, the true moral compass of a culture and a society is how it treats its most vulnerable people, our members. So what interests me, the question that this conference poses is, in a way, why do progressives or left-wing intellectuals find Schmitt still so attractive? And why, more specifically, why would a person like my father, who was a professor of hermeneutics, philosophy, who identified himself as kind of an arch-Jew, why would he, and I use the word advisedly, why would he engage with and want to understand and befriend a person like Carl Schmitt, and to understand Schmitt's anti-Semitism, or some might say anti-Judaism, his anti-liberalism, and his conception of the political. Now, my title was initially Gnostic, Antinomian Rabbi, my father, meets Despotic, Anti-Liberal Katechon. Now, for those who are a little rusty on their Greek, and I'm sure there's nobody in this room, but I had to look it up. And I was curious about what is a Katechon. And it seems to come out of Thessalonians 2 of Paul. And Paul is a very important character in this play because I think Paul, and some of you might know that my father wrote a book, or his last testament was the political theology of Paul. But for my father, this quote from Katechon seems to be something that Schmitt invented for himself. And he wanted to be perceived by posterity as the Katechon. And the Katechon, the character of the Katechon that Smith was projecting, is he who holds back or restrains the Antichrist before the second coming. That's a very revealing apologia to me of a person of Schmitt's character and track record as a Nazi collaborator. Why? Because in his mind, right, if we look at his theories of the state that I'm going to get into a little later, that the major distinction is between friend and enemy, that all important, significant concepts, right, of the modern theory of the state, right, are secularized theological concepts, all of these things. What is the Katechon to him? He's thinking of himself as holding back the Antichrist. It seems to me that if any movement in modern history, right, encapsulates, embodies the spirit of the Antichrist, it would be National Socialism. Certainly, if we're thinking of the gospel of Christ as forgive or, love your neighbor, love your enemy, this is not Schmitt's particular credo, right? We could say, I think we can all agree that is not what National Socialism was about. It was about what Schmitt would have said is, tell me, and this is very self-revealing in his glossarium, he says, tell me who your enemy is, and I'll tell you who you are. And I think that's something to think about as a political theorist, because one could turn that around certainly in my consciousness and psyche and say, tell me who your friend is, and I'll tell you who you are. So I wanted to change my title to, and I used Gnostic Antinomian for my father. In one of his incarnations, he was definitely Gnostic, that is, he had no spiritual investment in the world as it is. He really just didn't give a shit. He was much more concerned of changing the world to make it spiritually fit with his paradigm. Antinomian, he certainly was, both in the sense of agape, friendships, and eros. He was not a person of boundaries, right? He was always crossing boundaries, always pushing the envelope, always saying that Jews and Christians are all on the same continuum. This is a false dichotomy. This is a false, hard, it's not friend, enemy. It's like we're all friends here. Or maybe I should call my new talk frenemies, right? Friend and enemy. So back to my title. I think that my father went through a change. He went through a nervous breakdown in his 50s. And I think he went from being a Gnostic antinomian to being a Paulinian Jew. And I think this is the key to why he wanted to befriend somebody like Carl Schmitt, why he felt he could reach Carl Schmitt. So my new title is Paulinian Jew Befriends Failed Katechon. Or another way of looking at it is Paulinian Jew befriends, as my father would put it, and I think he was right, apocalyptic prophet of the counter-revolution. Okay, that was Schmitt. I would add to that apocalyptic prophet of the counter-reformation. And I'm going to explain why, because one of the major issues, and I think Susan brought this up, that Schmitt saw the enemy as was not just Jews, and I'm going to get into that. It was also Hobbes and Spinoza. He has a major, major axe to grind with the Protestant heresy. And I think it's very hard to understand Schmitt's politics and why he was so adamant on a unitary executive and not splitting off faith, church and state, but unifying them under, well, again, it's a disguise because Schmitt is a secular thinker, but still, remember, secular politics are just a disguise, just a veneer, just a facade of what? Theology, right? Of what the theological momentum is behind things. So that's my new title. Paulinian Jew befriends failed Katechon, one possibility, or apocalyptic prophet of the counter-revolution and counter-reformation. Okay. Why is he still crucial for progressives? Comparisons are odious, and some people have said, Santayana said, those who, fail to remember the past are cursed or condemned to repeat it. History does not really repeat itself, perhaps, But Mark Twain said something very, I think, caustic and wise. He said, although history might not repeat itself, it certainly fucking rhymes. And so if you look at the horizon about what's going on right now, he didn't use fucking, by the way. That was my interpolation. Because of the state of emergency in which we, the oppressed, seem to be living. But basically, the analogies are kind of disturbing and hard to ignore. I mean, the warning signs. And this is another thing, that Schmitt, in a way, can be looked at as a figure who is a kind of canary in the coal mine about what is happening right now in the world. That's the move towards authoritarian models, the idea that democracies or secular, liberal states cannot control the kind of chaos that's happening. And to be fair to Schmitt, you can make a critique of liberalism, right? I mean, it has a lot of problems. There's a lot of duplicity that goes in with it. It has a lot of excesses, unregulated capitalism, that's predatory, that creates inequality. All of these things are happening in the kind of, neoliberal socioeconomic world that we've built up for ourselves in this new global economy that we have. And Schmitt pointed out very early, he said, this is hypocrisy. If you look at liberalism, there's that kind of that ferocious underbelly to it where they talk about humanism and human rights and rule of law, but underneath they're robbing you blind. They're stealing from your wallet. It's world capitalism that's, again, predatory, ferocious. That's a perfectly legitimate critique. But his solution was not how to tame that juggernaut, how to tame that beast, but simply saying, no, the solution that we need to look for is dictatorship. And why? Because dictatorship is the only thing that can save the integrity of the state. I'm going to go back again to the saying that Schmitt said, where he said, show me who your enemy is, tell me who your enemy is, and I'll tell you who you are. I think we need to put ourselves back, and this goes to why there are so many echoes between Schmitt's time and our time as far as a state of emergency. What was Schmitt facing? And many reactionaries at that time. They were seeing the collapse of the world order as they knew it. All the empires, Austro-Hungarian, the Second Reich, they had disintegrated. Germany was humiliated. The Versailles treaties, they had to pay incredible reparations. They went through 2 hyperinflations and a couple of depressions. The middle class was wiped out as far as their being able to support themselves. There was tremendous uncertainty as far as beliefs and credo. I mean, everybody was in a state basically of trauma. And let's not forget that, so on the one side you had kind of capitalism that was in a way going out of control. It was in a Great Depression. It was falling apart. Things were falling apart. The center did not hold. And on the east, you had, what did you have? You had the Russian Revolution. And again, this was a revolution of the dictatorship, whose credo was dictatorship of the proletariat. This was absolutely terrifying to people who came from a background of hierarchy, order, everybody knows their place in a kind of Christian society. This is kind of in a medieval ideal utopia, right? This was like such a deep, disturbing vision. It was so violent. It was basically publicized itself as tearing everything apart. It was going to create a new earth and a new heaven, new values. It was not based on national, tribal identity. It was on a kind of a universal belief, right, that all people are equal and all will share in this new covenant. This is terrifying to a person of Schmitt's background and education and formation. But, so having said that, what I want to get to is 2 things that I think are important to keep in mind. Why Schmitt felt that Jews were the enemy, and why Schmitt felt that the secular modern state was the enemy. And not just an enemy like, we can have a discussion, we can have a disagreement, we can bargain, we can make friends. I'm talking about the existential, natural, providential enemy. I'm talking about hostis humanis generis, the enemy who is the enemy that must be exterminated, in the sense that Carthago delego est. We have to burn the place down, we have to put salt over it, and it is never to grow again, right? Or in the Old Testament, when God says to the Hebrews, I want you to exterminate Amalek, right? I want you to kill their women and children, their livestock, everything. This is the theological undercurrent, the difference of religion. So on the first thing, I just want us to be very clear that there might be people who think, well, was Schmitt really an anti-Semite? Was he really anti-Judaic? In the talk that my father had with Schmitt, he was challenged at a colloquium in France where he said, well, what did you discuss? Is Schmitt an anti-Semite? And my father said, yes, he's an anti-Semite. All we discussed was anti-Semitism. That's it. Everything was framed by anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. And it was the most ferocious, most turbulent discussion I had in German. He said, I don't know what the English discussion would have been like, but in German in my life. And so to get back, when we look at Schmitt's, just so that we kind of put that aside, that there's no ambiguity or equivocation about his anti-Judaism. He said things like in his diary, in his journal, that God orders, we follow God's command, we Christians follow God's command to fight and do battle with our enemies, right? This is our command. While the Jews sit on the sideline, right, and eat the flesh of the fallen, right, while, and the corpses on the battlefield. He was the one who said, a communist, this is in his diary, a communist, right? Mon cœur mis à nu, right? Remember Baudelaire? This is where you kind of show your real face, not the professional face, not the arch conservative grand jurist face, but the real face, the atavistic, the fears, the internal, the person who you really fear as enemy. He said the communists can be changed, can ameliorate, can improve themselves, but a Jew will always be a Jew. And lastly, he says, the most dangerous threat that we face is not just the Jew, but the assimilated Jew. Okay, so, now, because there have been people who said, well, there's not a lot of anti-Semitic writing before he joins the Nazi Party. I would argue that Schmitt was absolutely, there's a question that I guess we can all ask ourselves, and this is what my father asked himself. He said, how could a person of Schmitt's intellect and intelligence and learning, right, who basically what Freud did, right, as the visionary architect of psychoanalysis and brought to the world, that we think in psychological terms now in a way, it's imbued our culture, that Schmitt brought to life this idea of political theology, basically bringing it into focus for the rest of us, for the world really, the fact that ideology, secular ideology, is really a mask for what's underneath, what's the kind of like the religious animuses or fears that we still entertain, that are atavistic and very, very fundamental to who we are as human beings. Schmitt said, what Schmitt was afraid of, okay, so this is a person who brings in political theology, and yet and let me just add another thing about why he's so important. Just simply as a theorist, is that when he says that it's not only that there are theological or religious animuses running through politics, right, both because of its historical development and because of its sociological structure, he also says that the fundamental distinction, right, that we have to always recognize in politics, precisely because it has so much religious energy behind it, is the friend-enemy. And he was the one in the concept of the political who poured out a warning that he himself violated. He said, listen, guys, we need to be very careful when we make distinctions. when we make friend-enemy distinctions. It's very important. This is now the rational Schmitt, right? Not the Schmitt of the glossarium, showing his emotional and emotive and atavistic fears. This is the Schmitt saying, from what the Weberian Schmitt, the sociological Schmitt, he said, listen, we need to learn a lesson. We need to be careful when we make friend-enemy distinctions, not to demonize, not to criminalize our opponents. And why? He said, let's look at the war, the 30-year war. Let's look at the war of religion, where people in Europe, right, through the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, were massacring each other, right, wholesale, on issues of religion. And he said, we cannot go back to that. That's something that we need to graduate from. This is Carl Schmitt, right? This is the rational Carl Schmitt. And yet, when we ask that absolutely fundamental question, how could a person of his intellect and his, as a kind of, as a theorist of the state, as a jurist, as a thinker, as an advanced thinker, have joined the Nazi Party? And so here it is. I think that it's not really that much of a mystery if you put those two things together. The first thing is that Schmitt felt that Protestantism, and I'm going back to this now, and this is important to understand if you want to try to deconstruct Schmitt and why he felt, what my father called it, why he was seduced, right, by that glittering dross of Nazi ideology. The first part, the secular facade part that attracted him, was the unitary state idea. Was, again, remember, the Weimar Republic was in a state of constant tribulation, and it was a republic doomed to fail. Nobody liked it. Everybody was subverting it. There was never an independent judiciary. They were letting off every Nazi that they could find. There was never a strong parliament. The parliament was being torn apart again and again. And this is not the model of every democracy, but this is the model that Schmitt used as a kind of poster child for why liberalism was doomed to fail. It could not resist the threat from the East, right? The hordes of Judeo-Bolsheviks coming from over there. It certainly couldn't stop the world cataclysmic capitalist depression that was taking over. So what for Schmitt, I think he said to himself, hey, and he was advocating all through the 20s saying, listen, we need a strong executive. We cannot have parliamentary talk and discussions to the end, to the second coming. We need somebody who is going to make decisions, who is sovereign is he, right? Who decides the exception. We need to move forward to stop the crisis. And for that, you need a strong state. You can't have a legislature. We need to go back, in a way, to the divine right of kings, right? Which existed in in that kind of Catholic vision of unitary government, where you have the monarch as both the head of the ecclesiastical and religious, right, order, right, the spiritual order, and at the same time of the secular order. That was Schmitt's kind of, it was kind of like at the height of the Middle Ages, that image of, in Dante, where everything worked together. Everybody knew their place, the great chain of being. And so what happened? Hobbes comes in and says, no, to stop the civil war that's going on. He says, something, this is not a good idea. Yes, you need dictatorship, but something, we need a mortal sovereign. We need a sovereign that really puts aside religious things. It could be the head of the church in a nominal thing, but we need to have a social contract. You need there has to be some kind of social compact. Even if you look at the Hebrew Bible, again, very carefully, it's like Protestants looked at the Bible very carefully for information, for insight, and for inspiration, and for revelation. And what did they observe? They observed that this contract is not divine right of kings, right? The covenant that when Moses comes down, right, from Mount Sinai, he's not saying, okay, take it or leave it. He's saying, Moses is coming down and saying, here is a deal. If you accept this covenant, if you want to join and become the chosen people, the people of God, it's not because you're ethno-nationalists and bring it together. It's not because you have any kind of tribal affiliation or because you're related to your second cousin over here or whatever. No, it's a contract based, right, on the Ten Commandments, on following a certain kind of law, which hopefully one day, like Jeremiah 32, you'll be able to internalize and put that law in your heart, rather than having to kind of like have it be always an exterior command saying, do this, do that, et cetera, et cetera. That's important because that was Hobbes's inspiration. This is anathema to somebody like Schmitt, because basically, that's the first heresy, okay, that Protestant heresy, because they're looking back to the Old Testament. The second thing is that Schmitt identifies that Hobbes opened the Pandora's box, right, for splitting the sovereign, dividing the sovereign, cannibalizing the sovereign, weakening that central unifying ecclesiastic and secular power. And of course, the second most, so once he's opened that Pandora box, who jumps into it? Spinoza. Okay, the first who? Assimilated Jew. And what does he say? What is the message that is so threatening to a person of Schmitt's kind of Catholic psyche and sensibility? It's the idea of a complete wall between church and state. Not just a kind of like a mutable wall, a complete wall. That is, everybody under the sovereign, under the secular sovereign, should have complete right to worship whatever God they want. The state should have absolutely no power to crack down on you, to criticize you, to persecute you, right? For wanting to follow whatever light, inner daemon, as Plato would say, since you brought up Plato, that you want to follow, and has no business interfering. Now, this is cannibalizing the sovereign, the unitary state. I mean, you cannot have, this is like castrating the sovereign. So that's the side of the state. I've tried to show who did Schmitt fear, who was Schmitt's most threatening enemies. So let's turn now to the anti-Semitism or the anti-Judaism. I want to give an anecdote first. I had a conversation with my father actually about this a couple of months before he died. We were sitting in the Kempinski Cafe hotel. So all of you know that, right? So that's familiar, right? That should wake you up for a moment. And we were drinking coffee. And I knew he was dying of cancer. And I said to him, actually, my stepmother had informed me, I think in a way to get back at my father, because she knew I would definitely bring this up because of my politics. She said, you know that your father actually met with Carl Schmitt and befriended him? And I said, what? I didn't know the story at all. This was 1986, just the year, it was Christmas. So we met at this cafe, and I said to him, look, I know you've taught Heidegger your whole life. That's one thing. But why did you actually go to Plettenberg, right? Do a pilgrimage to Plettenberg to meet with this old Nazi? He's 93 years old. What did you guys talk about? Why? How could you do this? Do you know that? And actually, I have, as a lawyer, as a human rights lawyer, I know a lot about what happened in Nuremberg. And I happen to know that he was indicted initially. He was interviewed by Klempner, who was one of the interrogators in Nuremberg, where he basically, he was not found to be guilty of any of war crimes, crimes against humanity, or aggressive war, because he actually did not have any policy-making position. But what he did do is he supported the Enabling Act, he supported the Reichstag fire decree, right, where basically that allowed one, for the state under Article 48 to suspend all human rights, all constitutional protections, and to Schmitt's absolute delight, right, in the Enabling Act, shifted lawmaking power from the parliament, from the Reichstag, to what? The executive. That was it. Hitler was free to basically control the bureaucracy, to control the Leviathan. And that's what Schmitt's dream. So I don't think it's much of a mystery. So so I said to my father, and now we're getting to the underlying messianic, eschatological piece of Schmitt. So I said to my father, why would you want to befriend? I mean, this guy, basically was a jurist. He was a, the other thing Schmitt said during his interrogation at Nuremberg, at one point Klempner said, well, what would you call yourself? And he said, I would call myself an intellectual adventurer. And he said, well, aren't there any prices to your intellectual ideas? And Schmitt, I'm now, this is not verbatim, but basically Schmitt says, yeah, there's a lot of prices to be paid for ideas. And the guy says, well, what about the price of millions of people being killed for ideas that you seem to have held? And he says, and this is his answer, under Christianity, millions of people also were murdered and killed. And then he added, I always pay my bills. I take responsibility for what happened. Anyway, back to my father and me. So I'm not quite sure what bills he was thinking that he was paying, because he never publicly apologized. He never was repentant in any public way. So I said to my father, look, why would you want to befriend a person who has that kind of track record? And he said, because I'm not interested in judging, I'm interested in understanding. And this is in his letter as well. And I said, yeah, but there are a lot of other people in the world, who are, and he said, as a Jew, I felt that I couldn't choose to be a Nazi, right? And that Schmitt, had that choice and I wasn't in a position to choose. And I said, well, something, there were a lot of Germans who were non-Jews who actually chose to leave, like Thomas Mann, and his brother, who are prominent and didn't give their support to the regime. He said, yes. And then I said, there's another thing. There's a lot of Jews like you, Hannah Arendt, Saul Friedlander, Lucy de Sivitowitz, who felt very comfortable judging Germans who chose to be Nazis. He said, that's not the issue for me. I'm interested why a person like Schmitt would have done that. And I said, well then, so what? And I said, so what's the point? He said, because for me, there's no meaning to the word redemption, right? If a person like Schmitt, and even like Hitler, right, can't be forgiven if they truly repent. But I said, he didn't repent. He said, we don't know that for sure. Now, I want to just read, how much time do I have left?
So I do want to leave a chance for people to ask you questions.
Okay.
So I would say, you want 5 minutes? Can you say what you
I will try. I do want to read something that this is an important piece to try to bring together what I think is important about the messianic part. I wrote this. I said, for this conference, I want to explore the question of in Schmittian terms. Tell me who my enemy is, I'll tell you who you are. So based on his life, we talked about the two faces, right? We've talked about his loathing the state, the secular, right, liberal state, and invented by Hobbes, right? And opening that Pandora's box, and then the assimilated Spinoza taking it one step further and splitting it up, and then we can go into Montesquieu, but this is all Jewish. This is all Judeo-influenced, right? Remember, Schmitt is not that a Jew like myself individually, right, threatens Schmitt. It's the idea, it's the phantasmagoria of the Jew. So I'm gonna move on. The Jews, again, not like myself, but the mythologized, phantasmagorical Jew, the symbol of the Jew already evoked in Christianity's founding text of the Gospels and its 2,000-year Christian heritage and legacy, which embodies all of the projected threats and fears of Western Christian culture, says, even Schmitt himself in his glossarium says, the assimilated Jew is what I fear. Second, this inevitably leads to the next inquiry. What echoes my father's vexed question? How could a person like this want to engage and embrace something like National Socialism, or at least not so much the glittering gloss, but not so much Nazi racial version of anti-Judaism, as he coined it, theozoology, based on pseudoscience and eugenics. But I want to propose that beneath this Nazi regime's nihilistic political facade, its outward trappings, its fascist dictatorship and authoritarian theory of state that Schmitt embraced rather enthusiastically, even behind its blood and soil nationalism, its Führerprinzip, again, that Schmitt was very receptive to, of the charismatic leader, of the sovereign who decides the exception, that the Nazi Third Reich was also a messianic movement propelled by what some have called redemptive anti-Semitism. It was a millenarian movement that feared and demonized, again, the Jew as a natural providential enemy, as the historical foe that must be exterminated, utterly destroyed, to save humanity and to redeem the world. So I want to argue that Schmitt was seduced, again, for these two reasons, both because of the fascist theory of state, again, that was that he was receptive to, and which is, again, the secular nihilistic political side of it, and nihilistic side of it, a fascist dictatorship, and the messianic undercurrent. He approved of the Nazi incarnation of the modern state, of the fascist state. He embraced the Führerprinzip. He loved Caesarism and dictatorial rule that would bring order. He thought liberalism was the major threat to being accomplished that, because it was again a theory of state that had been Judaized, right? Every function of the state must reflect the omnipotent king, an emperor who legislates and executes and decides the law and governs by miracle through the exception, through the moment of revelation. He was seduced by Nazism, this more hidden and repressed messianic apocalyptical component that spoke to and resonated in his own political theology. He was attracted by, by the bastardized 19th century version. That's not what he was interested in, of anti-Semitism. But he was interested in, not in the pseudo-scientific career or something, but in the deep-rooted and ingrained anti-Judaism of his Catholic upbringing. He was seduced. He belonged to that Western culture which is steeped in the Christian church's deep-rooted fear and enmity towards Jews and Judaism. Now, where does this enmity come from? And this is something that my father, I think, very clearly perceived. And he's not unique, but I think everybody, modern scholarship, has pretty much established this. That is part of the church's foundational myth and story is, you could call it, perhaps its original sin, is that already present in the Gospels, you have a theology, right, whereby the Jews are rejected. The Jews rejected Christ as Savior and Messiah, and the church became the chosen people. So you have this idea of supersession. Like if you go back to Charlottesville, in America 2 years ago, what neo-Nazis and KKK were chanting is, Jews shall not replace us. This is part of this supersessionist theory. That is that because the Jews rejected Jesus as Savior, they are no longer the chosen people. We are the chosen people. Now, we have taken over. Interestingly enough, if you look at the Nazi ideology and you look under it, it's a kind of inverted Judaism. I would call it a black Seder. Not a black mass, but a black Seder. Why? Well, let's look at it just on very broad terms. What does the Nazi ideology assert? It asserts, no, Jews are not the chosen people. We are the chosen people, right? Hitler talks about, I am being led by providence with the assurance of a sleepwalker. They're very, very convinced that they have been chosen by providence, by history, right, to fulfill this 1,000-year Reich, right, that they now have the right will to power to do this, not the Jewish people. So you see already that coming through. As far as promised land, so they say we are the elected ones. We are the ones that choose. And we are the ones who are going to fulfill history. And as far as the promised land part of it is that, no. They think they have some kind of promised land or promise to rule the world, but no, we are the ones, through Lebensraum, we have the right to rule the world. It's very broad, but I want to get to the Gospels, because if you look at the Gospels, you have a fundamental problem. And that problem is that already in the Gospels themselves, you have, like in Matthew, you have Pilate during the trial saying, I wash my hands of this person. I am not guilty for this man's death. And the Jews say, when they have to choose between Jesus and Barabbas, they say, kill him, and let his blood be on us and on our children. Okay, so that's in the gospel. And then if you look at John, you have at least 70 parts of the gospel which say that the Jews themselves are the incarnation of evil, that the Jews are trying to persecute and kill Christ. I mean, there's already this bifurcation. So why did my father, lastly, want to reach out to Schmitt and he said, I don't want to, in his letter to him, he said, I don't want to burn my bridges, he said. I want to keep an open dialogue. I want us to be frenemies. I want to befriend you. I want to convince you that I am not the existential threat. I am not trying to take away whatever it is that you find sacred and that you find important. And what was that bridge? That bridge was Paul. And why was Paul that bridge, the Apostle Paul? Because for my father, Paul was, it's not my father's, this is not exclusive. I think it's accepted now as almost conventional wisdom that Paul did not convert to something called Christianity. Paul never defined himself as a Christian. Nobody in that community defined themselves as Christian at that point. Paul precedes the Gospels. Paul saw himself as called not as converting to something, but as called to be the Jewish apostle to the Gentiles, to bring the Gentiles in to basically the covenant. And what's really interesting, and I'll just leave you with these kind of little thoughts that other speakers and other conferences will have to look at, but I find this really fascinating. What did my father talk about with Schmitt? He basically, in a nutshell, everything that he said in the political theology of Paul, he talked with Schmitt about. And Schmitt said to him, you must tell somebody about this. This was 1979. You must tell somebody about this before you die. And what was Schmitt saying? My father, they said, I asked my father, what did you guys discuss? And he said, we discussed the creation of a people. And this is really important. Think about this. Why? Paul, when you look at Paul's letter to the Romans, 9 to 11, and my father says, and he talks about this, and he says, we're discussing the creation of a people. Why is that important? Because I think what my father was trying to say, that Paul compared himself to Moses. And why? He said, look, going back to what I said before, I want to create a covenant. I want to create a contract, like a compact with you, with a people. I want to create a people. If you agree to follow righteousness, if you agree to love each other, if you agree not to kill and not to do all these horrible things, right? You can be my people. We can have a deal. We can do this, right? It's not based, again, on tribal affiliation, on ethno-nationalism. It's based on spiritual values, on psychic spiritual values of friend. Let's be friends, right? Let's treat each other as friends. Let's treat the stranger, right, as the other, as a friend and not as an enemy, right? Paul actually goes one step further and says, that's what I want to do. I am now an apostle to the Gentiles. Why? Because I'm an apocalyptical Jew. I believe that the end times are coming. For the end times to be successful, to come into being, for the end of suffering, for redemption to happen. This isn't the kind of Jewish, what was happening at the time of Jesus. Rather than the zealot option of like revolt and the Messiah coming and maybe God intervening, opening the Red Sea, killing all the Egyptians. That's what they were hoping for. That this crucified Messiah is actually my ticket to getting Gentiles to mass convert. Because we need the end times to happen. And for that condition for the end times to happen is that all Gentiles, non-Jews, must recognize the true God. And if they don't, the end times ain't coming, right? So that was his problem. He thought it was going to happen at any moment, and this was his ticket. So at the very end, he said, I want to create a new dispensation, a new covenant, which tells Gentiles, hey, you don't have to follow the crazy dietary laws. You don't have to kind of follow those crazy, Sabbath rules. You can't do this, you can't do that. And much more important, to mail pagans and Gentiles. He said, hey, really important, you don't have to cut your phallus. You don't have to circumcise. You can believe in a true God, in that very elegant idea of a God who is righteous, not like the Greek gods that are running around being jealous and killing, saying, hit this guy. They're like mobsters, the Greek gods. They kind of go around saying, shoot this person, or I got a contract on him, and I know the Troy will win. No, the Greeks will win. No, he said, no. And in Paul's dispensation, he goes one step further than Moses. He says, not only do I want you to be a righteous people based on love, loving your neighbor, loving your enemy, which is also in the Bible, which is part of Hillel. You don't have to become, he says, I want us to abolish distinctions of Jew and Gentile, abolish distinctions of male and female, of master and slave. And ironically, if you take that political theology, if you look at the modern secular state, that's really its aspirational goal, is to break down those divisions, is to say you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex, on the basis of race, on the basis of, all of those things that we prohibit discrimination on, right? To create that beloved community together. I want to just leave you with one last thought. I want you to turn to your neighbor, and I want you to shake their hand, whether you know them or not. Just reach out. Go ahead, you can do it. I know we're very polite Germans here, or foreigners, but go ahead. Turn to your neighbor, shake their hand. Go ahead, shake their hand. You're not going to do it? You're not going to shake hands? You're too afraid. You're too scared. No, and why am I asking you to do that? Why am I asking you to do that? It's important. It's important because I think it comes back to what Schmitt's real insight was about friend and enemy. Yeah, there are two possible responses that we can have. I worked for 20 years processing refugees, interviewing asylum seekers around the world from 120 countries, from completely different religions, backgrounds, ethnicities, psychic makeup, frames of reference, but they all were human beings. And the issue is, beyond religion, beyond state, when you meet a person and you have two possible kind of anthropological basic responses that can happen. You can have fear and flight, suspicion, enmity. They're going to steal what I have. They're going to threaten me. They're going to threaten my family. Whatever it is, that initial atavistic fear of the unknown, of the other. What is that other going to do? And you project all those fears and all the possibilities that can happen depending on your prior experience. But there's another response that you can have, which is to welcome the stranger, to break through your initial trepidation or uncertainty and to welcome them, to give them protection. In your book, which I loved, you have Abraham, who, when three strangers come to his door, he has a choice. He can welcome them in, or he can say, no, I'm not going to welcome these strangers. I don't know who these guys are. They could be armed terrorists. They could be enemy combatants. They could be ISIS. They could be, who knows, right, who they are. But he does welcome them in. And if you look at the history of culture, this is a very deeply ingrained attribute of all human beings and all cultures, that we have very powerful rules of hospitality and welcoming the stranger that transcends all other barriers, all national boundaries, all geography and topography throughout history. And I think we need to keep that in mind, because I think the choice really is, that stands before us now in our own age of emergency, is that we can either kind of go the way of Abraham and welcome the stranger and welcome refugees, or we can go the way of Sodom and Gomorrah and kind of kick them out, persecute them, hunt them down, rape them, and project them as the enemy, make them our enemy. So I leave you with the idea that not tell me who your enemy is, and I'll tell you who you are, but tell me who your friends are. and I'll tell you who you are. Thank you.
But
Running off the stage.
yeah, no, thank you. You've set us up beautifully for this conference, but I want to give people a little bit of time if they have particular questions. Wait for the microphone, but I see two of you. 1 minute, this, right here. Yes, you, sir. Microphone is coming.
I'd just like to say that the Gnostic Antinomian that you sort of tried to leave for the Paulinian stayed with Taubes. He was inclined towards Gnostic things because he wanted to explain why the Jews had been eradicated, and with a evil creator God, that was easier to explain. To put it as, in very simple words. So, what are you saying when you're doing this Pauline point is not in opposition to that. It has to be thought with it.
Right.
Jürgen Frese and Richard Faber and others have argued very good for that. And I would also say that the story that the Pauline of the Pauline that you now related, that as Jan Assmann has argued, there's actually a big difference there towards what Schmitt was doing, and what they were telling to each other in that talk was probably more directly about the pace, love your enemies, which is not allowable in Schmitt's terms, but was allowable in Taubes' terms, and was interpreted in these Pauline terms. Yeah, and so that was the crux, and not that he was close, that Schmitt was so close to the Pauline version of Taubes.
Yeah, I never. I'm sorry if I gave the impression that Schmitt was close to the. This is my father's argument. So I think you heard me. You might have. Schmitt was a complete stranger to that argument. This was the argument that my father attempted to persuade, to befriend, to convince Schmitt about. Not that Schmitt ever was convinced, but I think that my father was trying to use the tools of secular, political theology that Schmitt had kind of like defined, and was his language, and to use that common language to reach out to Schmitt to say, you have mistook me all this while.
Thank you. Could you give the microphone to Jan Assmann behind you?
Yes, thank you so much, Ethan. So if you ask me who my friend is, I would say there he is. Well,
Should I trust you, though?
You can trust me, absolutely. So I would in Jacob's report or allusions to his dialogue with Carl Schmitt, there is one detail which always struck me as very impressive, and you did not tell about this.
Sure.
And so Jacob writes in his little text, ein Apokalyptiker der Gegenrevolution, and also in his text about the Paris debate,
right,
that he confronted Schmitt with the question of the distinction between weltlich and geistlich, so secular and
spiritual.
And if this distinction is abolished,
Yeah.
then geht uns der abendländische
Yeah.
Atem aus.
Can I respond to that?
Yes, of course, yes. Is this in any way related to this idea of the Unitarian state who abolishes all?
Yes, I think that's a great question, and I think what my father was trying to warn Schmitt about, and this goes to Schmitt's schizophrenia, because on the one hand, he was this great jurist, this great theorist of the state, right? And very much in the tradition of Weber, of looking at structure and history of things and trying to cull or winnow out what the essence was. And I think that the danger that my father was pointing out to Schmitt is saying, listen, you yourself warned about the dangers of this friend-enemy thing, right? That we need to limit, we need not to demonize, not to criminalize our enemies, not to fall back into political theology, right? And that separation, what I think he was trying to say to Schmitt is saying, listen, I understand your spiritual yearning to have a beloved community that fits your idea of redemption. But you have to be careful about merging secular power with that too much, because then you fall into that trap of not persuading, like in the liberal state, where we try to persuade the other person, to befriend the other person with a different point of view of salvation, but to force them, to coerce them. It's all or nothing. Once the theological side becomes completely intolerant. I'm just going to throw this out to you. I don't know. There's Paula White is the personal pastor for Donald Trump. And she recently came out with a speech vilifying Trump's critics as the incarnation of evil, and we see this everywhere now. We see this in the caliphate, which is a political theology, right? We see this emerging in many evangelical communities that are using theology as a weapon, right, to persuade their enemies. And I think that's what my father's talking about. We can't get this, if we start merging those two boundaries into a unitary state, then there's no dialogue left on spiritual issues, where we go back to Spinoza saying the state should not intervene here. We need something that's, every person needs a sacred private space to decide those issues for themselves, rather than be forced by the state and some kind of surveillance society to say, no, this is the only true God, and this is the only way to worship him, right? To be able to achieve that beloved community together. And let's not forget that National Socialism, I'm not saying this in a superficial way, it was a very successful, for a time, utopian movement. I mean, many people, it got Germany out of the Great Depression, there was a lot of idealism in coming together. So I'm just saying, I think what my father was saying is that if we just excoriate and judge, right? It's easy to do that on a descriptive level about Schmitt's involvement with the Nazis. That's an easy thing to say. That's a horrible thing. He's a horrible man. But that gets us nowhere in being able to take on that spirit of trying to understand. And I think trying to understand what's happening now in the world, why people are choosing Caesarism, or choosing authoritarian models of state, whether it's Bolsonaro in Brazil, whether it's Duterte in the Philippines, whether it's Orban in Hungary, whether it's Putin in Russia, that there's a very dangerous undercurrent of theology behind all of these movements that we don't see. And it's coming out either in Islamophobia, in anti-Judaism, because the Jews are always there in the background. I mean, the phantasmagorical Jew, right? As a scapegoat, as a boogeyman, to say, this is my enemy, and it has to be, we have to exterminate it. Anyway, I hope
Ethan, I'm going to take one more question. This gentleman here. Wie bitte?
Eine Frage oder Kommentar, dieses Einengen auf Fragen ist nicht Wissenschaft.
Entschuldigung, Sie haben... Ja, bei Tagungen haben wir es immer schwer, manchmal. Wir haben es gern, wenn länger diskutiert werden. Das tun wir auch bei unseren Einzelvorträgen. Bei Tagungen ist es natürlich immer schwer, genügende Zeit für Diskussion zu lassen. Deshalb in diesem Fall würde ich um Fragen bitten.
Thank you. I have 2 points. First, the problem of repentance of Carl Schmitt.
Yeah.
The second point is, who is the enemy? Is it only Judaism, or is there another enemy who comes into the game too? The first point, if really in the sight of Carl Schmitt we have a millennial fight,
A what? I'm sorry.
a millennial
millennial.
fight between apocalyptic tendencies and the immediate danger that apocalypse could come, and the Katechon that must be strong enough to stop at every moment the breakdown of order and the apocalypse that could come. If this really is the main question, then Schmitt had to make a choice, and he made his choice in favor of the Katechon to stop the apocalypse. Heinrich Meyer, in his book about Carl Schmitt, put a quotation of Schmitt in the 60s, where Schmitt asked, "Could it be that I helped to accelerate history?" Acceleration means acceleration towards the catastrophe of apocalypse. If my choice was wrong, choosing the Nazi party, if I helped to accelerate, then I was wrong. This is the only point where he could repent. He had no other reason to repent, only for this point, because this was his main
Concern.
Sorge,
Yeah.
his main concern. My second point, who is the enemy? In several writings, Schmitt accentuated that the great Russian thinkers, Bakunin, Kropotkin, and Dostoevsky.
I've read-
in the
I've read
first
all of it.
line,
I've read mine,
Dostoevsky, when they're coming into the European history, the enemy broke into European Geistesgeschichte. The main enemy was Russian anarchy and the orthodox theology of apokatastasis, grace, mercy for everybody. The main chapter.
Can I ask you to formulate your question, please?
My question is, could it be that there are other enemies too? That there are other enemies too, enemies, not only Judaism, but every intellectual current that leads to apocalyptic situations, and anarchy does.
Okay. I hope that in my presentation or performance or whatever it was, that I made it clear that it's not so much anti-Judaism itself that was the enemy. That happened to be the projection that most animated Schmitt in a lot of his writings. But I would agree that I would see it this way. When you look, for me, the most important thing is there's a point, yes, he thought that he was preserving the state. That's a fair point by joining National Socialism, right, at that point in history. And he asks the question himself, right, if I accelerated, right, the final disintegration, right, of the global, world order, I failed in my Katechon job, right? That was my failure. I'm not sure he ever resolved that, because I think that it's very clear that if you look at what's happened, right, that Nazism, I think he answered his own question. Nazism did everything possible to accelerate the apocalypse. It almost destroyed the world. I mean, now we have global warming kind of looming. We have a 10-year chance right now. We have an opportunity, right, in the next 10 years to stop the irreversible and the end of civilization as we know it. You might think I'm a apocalyptical thinker myself, and with a certain strange sense of urgency, but I have looked at the scientific evidence, like most of you sitting in this room, and it's very clear that these next 10 years, if we don't stop the oil and gas industries, it's over, it's game over. Anyway, so I would say this, that Schmitt failed as a Katechon because the Katechon was actually Nuremberg and was actually the world order that we set up after 70 million people were annihilated and 1/3 of the world's infrastructure was destroyed. It was 60 to 70 million, actually. There were 20 million Chinese that died as well. There were 5 million prisoners of war from Russia. We can go on and on and on as far as what the itinerary was. But that was, excuse my French, the fucking apocalypse. I mean, if you wanted apocalypse, the Nazis gave it to you in spades, right? So I don't think there's any question about whether he was, he served his role as Katechon. But what I think is fair to say is that he was an intellectual adventurer. He was a bit of an opportunist. And he jumped on board of the Nazi juggernaut. And he said, you know something? I like this ride right now. I like the power. Power is an inebriating, essence. I've been out of power for so long, just kind of speaking on the sidelines, and this is my chance to make a difference in history. And he miscalculated badly because it turned into the apocalypse. And I think that, the last that I would say is this, that again, Schmitt to me is a valedictory warning to all of us that follow the Schmitt, who is follow the the great legal theorist who saw the dangers of the friend-enemy divide, right, and the dangers of apocalypse, right, not the Schmitt, right, who violated that for power, to enjoy that aphrodisiac of making history. That's how I would end it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethan.